Good morning. I'm calling to order the meeting of the State Air Pollution Control Board. I believe we have a quorum. Everybody seems to be here except for two, and we've heard from both of them. So, ladies and gentlemen, you have an agenda before you. You've had an opportunity to review it. Are there any questions or amendments to the agenda? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve.
So moved.
Second.
Got a motion and a second. All in favor say aye.
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 And the agenda is approved. Thank you. The minutes of the June 5th meeting were circulated to you in advance of this meeting. Are there any amendments or changes to that? Is there, hearing none, without objection, those are also approved. Ms. Sebastiansky is not with us this morning, so we're privileged to have Megan Joyce to present the final exempt regulations for us. And she's got two of those, so welcome, Megan. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you. Let me see. Are we going to put my, there we go. So the first presentation I will be giving is tab B, so you should have the presentation in front of you. Good morning. My name is Megan Joyce. I'm the Air Compliance Manager for the Central Office of Air Compliance Coordination. For the first rule today, it is an exempt final regulation, the emissions guidelines for the existing crude oil and natural gas facilities. There we go. Some background on the regulations. Section 111D of the Federal Clean Air Act requires that EPA establish emissions guidelines, or EGs, for existing facilities that would otherwise be subject to New Source Performance Standard, or NSPS. States must adopt state enforceable regulations in order to enforce the federal requirements at the state level. Otherwise, EPA will impose a federal plan. Today's emissions guidelines for existing crude oil and natural gas facilities, subpart Quad OC of 40 CFR Part 60, was issued on December 6, 2022, same as the applicability date, and published in the Federal Register on March 8, 2024. The state plans are due by March 9, 2026, and final compliance for facilities is due by March 9, 2029. Originally, there was subpart Quad O and then revised to subpart Quad OA and Quad OB for new sources. This is the first emissions guidelines for existing sources. DEQ has been working with stakeholders since 2018 in absence of a federal rule. In 2022, the group decided to wait for a federal rule instead of establishing a standalone Virginia rule. Everyone knows this is coming for Virginia. Here is a diagram for where the EPA rules apply. All we care about is north of the city gate, which is number 8 on the diagram, or north of distribution. This includes the production and processing at well sites, storage, compressor stations, and natural gas processing plants, as well as the natural gas transmission and storage at compressor stations and storage tank batteries. Just a few highlights of these emissions guidelines. The regulations include routine monitoring for leaks, documentation that the wells are properly closed and plugged, reduced flaring, that the control devices must operate properly on a continuous basis, emission standards for dry seal compressors, and added best management practices to minimize or eliminate venting. One feature of this EG that is new and unusual is the super emitter program. This does not affect DEQ and is not a requirement of the states. EPA is in charge of this program, which allows third parties to apply to EPA to become certified to send data about these large methane events. EPA will then approve the third-party notifiers, receive and evaluate the third-party data, notify owners and operators, and make the super emitter data public on a timely basis. Only approved remote sensing technologies like satellites and aerial monitoring will be allowed. This program is more focused on the vast fields and large methane dumps in places like Colorado, rather than the smaller production and processing places in Virginia. This program is brand new, and no one is sure how it will work out, but fortunately, it is not a requirement for Virginia. Here are some statistics on the natural gas production in Virginia. There are 8,416 permitted gas wells located in Buchanan, Dickinson, Russell, Lee, Scott, Tazewell, and Wise counties of Virginia. There are 17 companies that produced 88.2 billion cubic feet of natural gas in 2022, with an estimated market value of $589.6 million. These are not small businesses that own these wells. However, due to the size of the individual wells, most do not have permits with DEQ. They are permitted and/or registered with Virginia Energy, and we are working closely with them regarding these wells. In contrast, the compressor stations are permitted with DEQ for various reasons. There are approximately 48 compressor stations with DEQ air permits. These permits require NOx, VOC, and PM controls based on long-standing EPA requirements, such as case-by-case NSR, the NOx SIP call, and best available retrofit technology. Some background on the oil production in Virginia. Oil was first produced in Virginia in 1942 in Lee County. Currently, there are 53 wells producing oil and gas in Lee and Wise counties from 4 different companies. In 2022, Virginia produced approximately 7,267 barrels of oil at an estimated market value of $671,000 versus 1.8 million barrels in Texas. So, as you can see, we are a small producer compared to others. Today's action is to adopt the federal emissions guidelines into a standalone state rule. This will enable Virginia to meet the EPA Section 111D and Part 60 obligations and avoid the imposition of a federal plan. The implications of a federal plan would require facilities to report to EPA and not DEQ. Virginia sources would prefer to work with us and not directly with EPA. We are incorporating the federal regulations by reference. This action is exempt from the standard regulatory adoption process by Section 2.2-4006A4C of the Administrative Process Act. This action is necessary to conform to federal requirements. Before I proceed to my recommendation, are there any questions?
Members of the board, any
I do. So, Megan, question. You, in your presentation, mentioned there are numerous facilities that are being covered under this rule. I was curious as to what resources additionally the department will need to 8,000 or plus facilities, as you mentioned. How is the department going to manage that?
Yeah, let me get to that. So this is actually an unfunded mandate. So our enforcement strategy for this program will be complaint-driven. We will be developing an inspection strategy in accordance with our policies where we will conduct random spot inspections, and we'll also be working with our EPA partners.
And if I had a follow-up question, so this is for existing sources. What about new sources? Because this is from 22. What about new sources coming on? Are they how are they regulated similarly?
So that will be in the next presentation. That's going to be through Quad OB, which we are going to ask for delegation for in the next presentation.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Russell. Any other questions, comments from the board? So you've heard the staff's recommendation. What's your pleasure?
No, I haven't read the recommendation yet.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
I've read the staff recommendation, but I'd like everyone to hear it.
So, I'll go. So, it is the department's recommendation that the board adopt the proposal with an effective date consistent with the Administrative Process Act In adopting this proposal, the board affirms that it will receive, consider, and respond to petitions by any person at any time with respect to reconsideration or revision as provided in Section 2.2-4006B of the Administrative Process Act.
We have now seen and heard the staff's recommendation. What's your pleasure?
Move the motion.
There's a motion to approve the recommendation of the staff. Is there a second?
Second.
There's a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion from the board? Hearing none, all in favor, please signify. Do we need to do a vote by hand, or can we just do a voice vote on this?
A voice vote's fine, but you do not need to do a roll call.
Okay. All in favor, please signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, like sign. Hearing none, the motion is passed. Congratulations, Megan. You're 1 for 1.
Thank you.
That's a great start.
Thank you. Okay, I have a second. I have a second presentation. It is tab C, and you should have the presentation in front of you as well. So for my second regulation of the day, it is an exempt final regulation, documents incorporated by reference. Some background on the regulations. The Clean Air Act allows EPA to delegate implementation and enforcement of the following programs to the states: the New Source Performance Standards, NSPS, National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, NESHAPs, National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants for source categories, also known as Maximum Achievable Control Technology, or MACT standards. EPA is required to review these regulations every 8 years. States must demonstrate their ability to implement these programs. EPA delegates authority to the states by letter. Virginia has been delegated authority from EPA for these regulations. Some more background. The board needs to incorporate the new standards in order for DEQ to obtain enforcement authority from EPA. Otherwise, enforcement authority will remain with EPA. These new standards also reflect the most current technical research. Today's action will be to update the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, book date references to July 1, 2024. The reason for this date is the Federal Printing Office uses July 1 to June 30th of the following year. Today, we are adding 11 new NSPSs. It is unusual to have 11 new regulations. The titles and section references are also being updated as needed, but there are no slides on this as these are minor updates. So the original NSPS Quad O has been regulated since 2012, and Subpart Quad O-A since 2016. The information in the presentation is for NSPS Subpart Quad O-B, crude oil and natural gas facilities for which construction, modification, or reconstruction commenced after December 6, 2022. We also discussed the emissions guidelines in NSPS Subpart Quad O-C earlier. This regulation controls methane, a greenhouse gas, smog-forming VOCs, hazardous air pollutants like benzene and toluene through improved and upgraded, more stringent monitoring. It creates a new super-emitter program, and there are approximately 66 wells anticipated to be subject to this regulation. Approximately 22 have been drilled since the applicability date of December 6, 2022. There are currently no new transmission projects known or anticipated. Virginia does have 2 compressor stations subject to NSPS Subpart Quad O-A, which are Transco Station 165 in Pennsylvania and BHE Leesburg, but nothing newer. So the original NSPS Subpart L was established in 1977. This new NSPS Subpart LA, secondary lead smelters for which construction, reconstruction, or modification commenced after December 1, 2022, also known as battery recycling. This regulation controls the toxic pollutants of lead, cadmium, and arsenic. There are no facilities in Virginia that are subject to these regulations, and none are coming up either. The original NSPS Subpart Big A was established in 1984. Subpart Big A, Little a was also established in 1984. This new NSPS Subpart Big A, Little b, steel plants, electric arc furnaces, and argon oxygen decarbonization vessels constructed after May 16, 2022. This regulation controls particulate matter, and we have 2 existing facilities in Virginia subject to Big A, Little a, which are Chaparral and Steel Dynamics. So, the following regulations are associated with the synthetic organic chemicals manufacturing industry. These regulations are for facilities for which construction, reconstruction, or modification commenced after April 25th, 2023. The original Subpart VV was established in 1983, and VVA was in 2007. This new Subpart VVB is for equipment leaks of VOC. The original Subpart 3I was established in 1990. This new Subpart 3IA is for VOC emissions for air oxidation unit processes. The original Subpart 3N was established in 1990, and this new Subpart 3NA is for VOC emissions from distillation operations. The original Subpart 3R was established in 1993, and this new Subpart 3RA is for VOC emissions from reactor processes. The facilities subject to any of these parts used to be considered new sources, according to the regulations, but with these updates, they are no longer new sources. Some of these facilities include Advancix, Celanese Acetate, Fujifilm Waco Chemicals, and Solenis. The original NSPS Subpart XX was established in 1983. The new Subpart XXA is for bulk gasoline terminals that commenced construction, modification, or reconstruction after June 10th of 2022. This regulation controls VOCs, and there are 22 existing facilities in Virginia and no new facilities. The original NSPS Subpart 3T was established in 1988. The new Subpart 3TA is for industrial surface coatings, surface coating of plastic parts for business machines for which construction, reconstruction, or modification commenced after June 21st, 2022. This regulation controls VOCs, and there are no existing or new facilities in Virginia subject to this regulation. NSPS Subpart 4T, greenhouse gas emissions for electric generating units, was established in 2015. However, due to an oversight, it is now being added to the list of delegated regulations. There are 2 existing facilities in Virginia subject to these regulations, Dominion Brunswick and Dominion Greensville. Subpart 4TA is for greenhouse gas emissions for modified coal-fired steam electric generating units and new construction and reconstruction stationary combustion electric generating units that are commencing modification, construction, or reconstruction after May 23, 2023. This regulation controls carbon dioxide. There is potential that the Chesterfield Reliability Project may be applicable to this regulation. However, this is a starting point. This project will still have to go through the new source review permitting process. Before I move on to the adoption process, I would like to add that EPA made administrative updates, for example, compliance testing, e-reporting, and startup shutdown malfunction requirements to the MACT regulations, as well as numbering changes that are not significant. However, there are no slides on these minor changes. This action is exempt from the standard regulatory adoption process by Section 2.2-4006A4C of the Administrative Process Act. This action is necessary to conform to federal requirements. Before I proceed to my recommendation, does anyone have any questions?
Are there any questions from the board?
I've got
Russ,
a
go ahead.
I've got a question for
Okay.
you. So for these regulations that are going to be incorporated into the state's regulatory framework, are these only for major sources, or does this include minor sources as well?
It could include both. It depends on the applicability of the regulation.
Okay. And then the last part would be, are there any changes to the MAC, maximum achievable control technology, for each of these different sections that you just referenced?
These are a different section of the regulations. These are the new source performance standards. So the MACT standards are different. Yeah.
There are some very minor administrative changes being made to certain MAC standards, but it's just changing basically format and some numbering, but no substantive changes are being made.
Okay.
Right.
All right, there's no technical changes?
No, it was all made, it's all EPA-led changes.
Okay.
So we're just matching.
All right. Thanks, Mike.
Any further questions from the board? Comments?
Okay. Can we go back to? There we go. It is the department's recommendation that the board adopt the proposal with an effective date consistent with the Administrative Process Act. In adopting this proposal, the board affirms that it will receive, consider, and respond to petitions by any person at any time with respect to reconsideration or revision, as provided in Section 2.2-4006B of the Administrative Process Act.
Big M, little m, what begins with M? Megan wants a motion. M. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the recommendation of staff. Are there any further questions or discussion? Hearing none, do we have a motion?
I move to adopt.
I have a motion. I think I have a second.
Second.
And unless there's any further discussion, all in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, like sign. And the motion carries. Megan, thank you very much.
you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So now we will invite our old friend Mike Dowd to talk to us about the cruise ships.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I have a tough act to follow. She's 2 for 2 in her in her board career. But first, what I'll present on is a petition for rulemaking for ocean-class passenger cruise ships. First, a little background. Yes, it worked. Section 2.2-4007 of the Virginia Code, which is also the Administrative Process Act, allows people to petition for new or amended regulations. The statute imposes some pretty tight deadlines. DEQ must send the petition to the Virginia Register within 14 days of receipt, to be followed by a 21-day public comment period following publication in the Virginia Register. And within 90 days of the close of the comment period, the board must issue a written decision to either grant or deny the requested petition, which would start a rulemaking process at that point. This petition was received by DEQ on September 30th, 2024, and the petitioner's name is Robert Hodson. The petition asks that the board initiate a new regulatory rulemaking for ocean-class passenger cruise ships to do the following: mandate the use of low-sulfur fuel, ban the use of exhaust gas cleaning systems, also known as open-loop scrubbers, require the use of shore power, restrict the dumping of gray water, black water, and other environmentally detrimental waste products, and finally, to require incident reporting and independent monitoring to assure compliance. The public comment period on the petition ran from October 21st through November 11th, 2024. We received approximately 45 comments through town hall, email, and sponsored petition signatures and e-letters. Approximately 35 comments supported the petition, generally agreeing with petitioner that cruise ships need regulation to control air and water pollution and that current federal standards are not sufficient. These commenters also raised arguments that ocean cruise ships damage the local economy and negatively impact the quality of life in the Yorktown, Norfolk regions. On the other hand, on the other side, approximately 7 comments were filed in opposition to the petition, maintaining that current federal requirements are indeed adequate for controlling air and water pollution from cruise ships, and touting the economic benefits cruise ships bring to the region. For more detail, the board book that was sent to you contains DEQ's responses to the public comments, and nearly all of the comments can be found on Town Hall in their entirety. DEQ will recommend that the board deny the petition for the following reasons. With respect to issues 1 through 3 and issue 5, the Code of Virginia at section 10.1-1307B allows the board to adopt regulations controlling emissions from mobile sources only, as provided in section 10.1-1307.05 of the Code concerning light, medium, and heavy-duty motor vehicles under California's Clean Cars program, and Article 22, Chapter 10 of Title 46.2 of the Code with respect to the motor vehicle emissions inspection and maintenance program that's currently in effect in Northern Virginia. Therefore, the granting of the petition would violate state law. In addition, Section 209E1 of the Federal Clean Air Act forbids states, except California, from regulating emissions from mobile sources such as ships. And I'll note that ocean cruise ships are already regulated under international agreement. The requirements of IMO 2020 stands for International Maritime Organization, an agreement reached in 2020, which has been adopted by EPA and are enforced by the United States Coast Guard, limit the sulfur content of ships' fuel to 0.1% sulfur, and impose extensive record-keeping requirements on ships. And finally, with respect to issue 4, and this should go without saying, but I'll say it anyways, the board lacks authority to regulate on water issues, and that this petition was also filed with the Water Board as well, and they will be considering it at their next meeting in a few weeks. So I guess before I go to my recommendation, I'll follow Megan's lead on this. I'll ask for any questions before jumping to the recommendation.
Ladies and gentlemen, do we have any questions for Mr. Dowd?
Question.
Yes, sir.
Are there any plans for the Air Board to pass its own regulations, or are we dependent on the federal government?
Well, at the moment, I believe that the board is forbidden to pass regulations regulating mobile sources such as cruise ships. So I would not see the board entertaining such a regulation, but that depends on your decision in a couple of minutes, I guess. But basically, yes, we follow what EPA does. EPA has promulgated regulations controlling ship emissions in what are called emission control areas of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. And in turn, EPA has adopted what is IMO 2020, which is an international agreement. It's not exactly a treaty, but it's close to a treaty. It was adopted by EPA. I don't think it was formally ratified by the Senate, though, but it was adopted by EPA. Long-winded answer to your question, sorry.
Any other questions, Russ?
I do have a question.
Yes, sir.
Mike, in your presentation, you mentioned California.
Yes.
I read the petition. I also found the reference in there about California. Could you explain why California is able to regulate this situation and Virginia is not?
That's very historical. Actually, when they passed the Clean Air Act back in, I believe it was back in 1970 or so, the pollution problems in Southern California in the Los Angeles basin were so pronounced, so worse than all the other than any other place in the country, that the Clean Air Act did give California the ability to regulate tailpipe standards, emission standards from mobile sources. Now, California's authority to do so had to be approved by EPA, and EPA has done so. It's been the subject of lots of litigation lately about whether EPA should have approved what they call the California waiver. California has promulgated regulations for cruise ships that go beyond what the IMO 2020 has. But the state law that we follow, the State Air Pollution Control Law in the Clean Car Act that was passed a couple of years ago, does not provide the board the authority to regulate ships. It's strictly narrowed to adopting the light, medium, or heavy-duty standards from California. Yes, ma'am.
Referenced a code section that defined motor vehicles, I believe, was what was on the slide, and and then you used a phrase for mobile vessels or whatever the phrase was. I assume cruise ships fall
Yes.
under the category of motorized. Okay.
Yes, they are considered a motor vehicle.
Okay.
They're not a stationary source. It's stationary sources and motor vehicles, and they do fall under the motor vehicle
Okay, understood.
definition.
Emily, welcome to the board, first of all.
Thank you. One question, you mentioned
Yes.
the California waiver process and how they've already promulgated regulations on cruise ships. Is that a regulation that we're seeing getting carried out more nationwide, as we've seen with vehicle standards and other things in that nature?
Not in the air world, no. Water is a whole different, states regulate water and the water board will have to
I won't
wrestle
ask you
with
any
that.
water questions.
But the answer basically, I do think Oregon and Washington may have adopted some more stringent regulations than IMO under that.
Any further questions from the board? Mike, you want to make your recommendation?
I will make the recommendation. The department's recommendation is that based on previously stated conclusions, the department recommends that the board deny the petition.
So you've heard the recommendation. I'd like to hear from council. The staff has told us this is beyond our jurisdiction. And oddly enough, the question of our jurisdiction is on people's minds of late. So can you tell me, do you concur?
I do, Mr. Chairman. I've reviewed the staff's very thorough analysis of this question, and I agree with it. The board does not have jurisdiction over this issue.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, staff and our council have advised us we don't have jurisdiction on this. Is there any further question for further discussion? Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
So we have a motion and a second to deny the application, to deny the petition. Any further discussion from the board?
I guess for point of clarification, if we don't have jurisdiction, do we have jurisdiction to vote on the matter at all?
Eric, should we vote on this, or should we just let it die for lack of a motion?
The board can vote on it. Any board, any agency always has jurisdiction to say that it does not have jurisdiction.
Understood.
And I'll just add to that, the statute does require the board to issue a written ruling or whatever you call it, a written decision on the petition itself. So I think there has to be some action taken by the board to.
I guess I just wanted to clarify that our motion is to move that we don't have jurisdiction, not necessarily a motion to deny.
Well, staff's recommendation was to deny the petition because we don't have jurisdiction.
Understood.
Did I state that correctly?
Go back to can I see the precise language again? How do I get back to it? Yeah, under the APA, it needs to be either grant or deny. Yes, I was just informed by one of my counsel here, our policy director, that the statute says there has to either be an approval or denial.
So the staff's recommendation, endorsed by two branches of the Attorney General's office, is that we don't have jurisdiction, but that we must take action. And since we don't have jurisdiction, the only action available to us is to deny the petition. We have a motion and a second on that. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, like sign. Hearing none, the petition is denied. Thank you, Mike. What's next?
Next is a report to the board regarding controversial permits. This is going to be a very brief presentation. There are two controversial permits that have been presented to the board before. One of them is with respect to one of them is the Chesterfield Energy Reliability Center, or CERC, Dominion's proposed project to build 4 simple cycle gas turbines at the existing site of the Chesterfield Power Station. That permit, we are expecting to receive air quality monitoring data, their report from Dominion presently in the next couple of weeks or so. And as soon as we get those data, as soon as we get the air quality modeling data, we will be processing the permit. So there really hasn't been much activity on that other than Dominion doing the air quality modeling.
So we don't have authority to act on these things as we're not a permit issuing agency, but we do get reports on potentially controversial projects like this, and we can comment on them if we want to. Those comments don't constrain anyone. Are there any comments?
Jim, I have not a comment, but a question.
Sure.
My previous board meetings, you presented this, and there was a question, if I recall correctly, with Chesterfield County regarding site suitability. Has there been any resolution with regard to that?
Not.
If I understood it previously, they were asking the department to make a ruling on suitability.
And I'll look over to my boss on the board, Mr. Rolban, but I would say at this point that subject is still under consideration.
Right. It's part of our permit review process.
Yeah. So there's been no
premature to make any statements on it.
Okay.
Okay, very good. Thanks.
Thanks, Russell. Any other comments or questions for Mr. Dowd on this? Hearing none, I guess you can go on to your next subject.
The next permit, controversial permit, is Southeastern Public Service Authority, known as SEPSA Regional Landfill. They filed a permit application. They're expanding their landfill. It requires multiple permits from multiple parts of DEQ as well as the Army Corps of Engineers, but they did file an air permit application to expand their leachate collection system. They propose to basically burn leachate, flare it off, rather than land dispose it or treat it in some other method. It's a somewhat complicated permit because when you burn leachate, we got to they and us have to get our hands around what the emission factors are for the various pollutants that will be consumed. They're also waiting for permits from DEQ with respect to wetlands in the core, so they haven't really been pushing the air permit. We're still, with respect to the air permit, we're still working with SEPSA on their air quality analysis. But it's moving forward, and I don't have a time frame for a draft permit yet. And yeah, those are the only 2 permits on my list.
Any comments or questions on this one? Thank you, Mr. Dowd. As always, it's a pleasure to see you.
Thank you.
Appreciate your representation. It's time for our director's report.
And I will introduce, usually the director gives the director's report, but I'm deferring to Tom Ballou, one of our folks here, to talk about the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program. Give an update
Ballou,
on that.
welcome. It's great to meet you.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the board.
We hope that you'll do as well as Megan.
Well, luckily, this is just an informational exercise, so I'm not. I'm already must apologize up front because I neglected my duty to get you copies of the presentation. I think I was thrown off because Ms. Sebastiansky is not here, and she always keeps us on the straight and narrow. So I will work with policy to make sure that you get copies of this presentation. So again, my name is Tom Ballou. I've actually been with DEQ going on almost over 30 years. I'm the air quality planning manager, work for Mike. We do all sorts of things from emissions inventories, which I'll talk about later in this presentation, to traditional air quality plans, and now climate plans as well. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is an update on the climate pollution reduction grant program that we've been implementing. Believe Mr. Dowd made a presentation earlier on, I think last year, on this, the early steps of this process. So we're going to give you an update of what we've been doing thus far. So just a little review on the climate. The CPRG program is administered by EPA. It is part of the much larger Inflation Reduction Act. The CPRG funding was about 1% of the total value of the IRA, both programs and tax incentives. The CPRG has two phases. One was a much smaller grant to states and MSAs to do climate action planning, about $250 million, and a much larger $4.6 billion available for a competitive grant program for implementation project, implementing mitigation projects throughout the country. DEQ was early on designated as the lead agency for the planning process that goes along with the CPRG program. We were awarded a $3 million grant by EPA in July of 2023. And since then, the requirements of this grant are to do three things. One, first is develop what was called a Priority Climate Action Plan, or PCAP. This then enabled us to apply for implementation grants, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. After that was completed, we are now in the process of starting to develop a Comprehensive Climate Action Plan, or CCAP. I will talk a lot more about that in this presentation. And then once we're all done with those plans and have a couple of years of implementation under our belts, we will have to develop a status report in 2027. So just to review the PCAP, or Priority Climate Action Plan, we developed a Priority Climate Action Plan and submitted it to the EPA in March 1st of 2024. It really focused on short-term types of actions that could be implemented that would have an impact in reducing climate pollution in Virginia in the short term, basically between 2025 and 2030. And it identified 9 high-level measures where actions could be taken. These were basically done on a sector basis: transportation, power sector, buildings, and so on. It was intended to cover all the potential actions that either could be implemented by the state or local governments, because the PCAP essentially served as the gatekeeper or the enabler for us to then submit applications for this competitive implementation grant process. So it was really kind of a compendium of all the types of projects that we might be able to be implemented and through this grant program. In doing that, we consulted with other state agencies, we consulted with local governments and the public. We had a fairly extensive public outreach and engagement plan over about 3 months, and all of that input and types of potential projects went into this Priority Climate Action Plan. The one kind of shortcoming of this is EPA was on a very fast track to get this PCAP and these implementation grants out the door, so we had very limited time to put this the short-term plan together, which kind of made it, and that combined with the fact that we were trying to cover all the potential projects that could be implemented, it was kind of wound up being an overly broad plan without. Had a lot of specifics, but it did not delve into lots of details on what the effects or impacts or benefits of these programs might be. And again, we were under the timeline the EPA gave us, so we did the best we could. So once we got this PCAP submitted to EPA, we then moved on to submitting these implementation grants to EPA. Again, it was done on a competitive basis, so I believe, I think over 400 or close to 400 applications were submitted to EPA. We being DEQ, submitted or were a part of 3 applications. And to our surprise and pleasure, we were actually awarded two of these 3 grants. This was a very big win for DEQ, for our partners, and for Virginia, because the combination of these 2 grants are bringing about $200 million of federal funds to Virginia to implement mitigation projects. So the two grants that were awarded, the first one was what we call a natural and working lands grant. This was actually a four-state coalition grant. North Carolina was the lead on this, but we also put projects into this coalition grant. So it was North Carolina, Virginia, South Carolina, and Maryland. Approximately $100 million will be coming to Virginia as part of this grant. We have upfront 10 projects that will be implemented through the Department of Wildlife Resources, the Virginia Port Authority, and on tribal lands. That's for $50 million. And then TNC is also going to be administering a regional part of this project, and it is anticipated that their projects will bring an additional $48 million to Virginia. The second grant award that we got was for Priority Methane Reduction Grant. This was a coalition with Virginia Energy, and there are 3 projects involved in that, worth about $100 million. The largest of these is the coal mine methane capture and utilization project that will be administered by Virginia Energy and is at an amount level of $80 million. The other 2 projects are smaller in scale, but will be implemented by EPA. The first one is landfill capture and utilization, $10 million, which will be kind of implemented by our land division. And then a food rescue and composting program, which will be developed and implemented by our environmental enhancement and pollution prevention folks. So moving on, as I said earlier, we are now in the process of starting to develop this comprehensive climate action plan. Unlike the PCAP, this is a longer-term plan. Its scope would be from 20 to 25 years and would be aimed to identify potential pathways to reduce climate pollution going out into those timeframes. It must include a number of things per EPA grant requirements. We have to have a GHG emissions inventory and projections of those inventories out to those future years. We have to do both an interim projection and a long-term projection to either 20 or 25 years. We have to develop or assess GHG reduction targets or goals. We must quantify potential GHG emission reductions or measures for all the sectors. We have to do a number of analyses, including benefits analysis, which means what additional benefits are we getting in from air quality improvements based on side reduction of criteria pollutants such as NOx, VOC, SO2, particulate matter. We have to do a low-income and disadvantaged community analysis. What that essentially means is what impact and benefits are these what we call LIDAC communities, and that's an EPA word, low-income and disadvantaged communities. What benefits are they getting from the plan and the reduction, the strategies in the plan? Also have to do a workforce planning analysis. What types of gaps do we have in the current workforce that would be needed to implement things like energy efficiency, renewable energy, and such? And what opportunities are also there in terms of developing workforce to meet the needs that would assist in implementing the programs the potential programs that would be in the plan. I have to review what existing authorities and or additional authorities we might need to implement parts or all of this program or the plan, and where are the funding sources that might be available. And again, the focus is on federal funding sources that might assist us in implementing parts or all of the CCAP plan. So this is a very high level of what exactly a long-range climate action plan looks like. We have to develop what's called a business as usual projection scenario. And what that is, and I'll give you the definition. It basically builds on a GHG inventory and projects emissions out under a status quo or existing program type of situation. It usually uses either national data sets or EPA data sets to make those projections. And I'll also say the definition of a GHG inventory is basically a compilation of all emissions from all sources, and I'll get into a lot more into the inventory here later in the presentation. But once you develop this business as usual projection, you then start developing and testing what would it take or potential policy scenarios and pathways to reduce GHG emissions, either to a certain target level or under a certain level of effort. And that is to be determined. That none of those decisions have been made yet. But again, you then test the various scenarios for the benefits in terms of air quality and GHG reductions, as well as costs. And we will, at some point, are going to have to consider some of the things that are already out there, such as federal programs, the 111D, 111B requirements for power plants, state statutes like the Virginia Clean Economy Act, and the impact of the implementation projects that we have been awarded as well. So all that is going to have to be considered in some way as part of the entire process of developing our future projections and what emission reductions might come from those programs. EPA has placed a very heavy focus on outreach, coordination, and engagement. This is just a very simple graphic showing all the various parts of paths of input we're going to be getting from various sectors in the development of this plan. It includes state agencies. We're developing a work group of all our sister state agencies that are going to have an interest in this process. We, of course, are going to be focusing our engagement and outreach on low-income and disadvantaged communities. Again, they're defined by EPA. There's a certain specific definition, and we know where those areas are located in Virginia. Obviously, we're going to be looking for input and providing a lot of opportunity to the general public. We have a stakeholder group currently operating, and Ms. Dominich is a member of that stakeholder. We had our first meeting on a couple of weeks ago. So that is currently underway. That's kind of our first step in getting this outreach and engagement process going. And then we also want to work with our local and regional organizations. One thing I neglected to mention is three MSAs in Virginia also got planning grants, and they are Northern Virginia, which is part of the D.C. planning area, Richmond, and Hampton Roads. So we will be working, they're doing the same thing we're doing in terms of this planning exercise. And we plan to coordinate with them as much as we can and leverage their outreach and engagement with ours so that we can get maximum coverage across the state. So this is the tentative timeline for development and submission of the PCAP, or the CCAP, excuse me. We've already started the stakeholder group. We are going to begin our outreach. We're first developing a plan for public and LIDAC outreach, and then we'll implement that probably in a January timeframe. That'll probably be 2 or 3 month process of getting initial input from all those groups I mentioned earlier. We'll complete that March, April timeframe. Then we actually have a contractor on board to assist us in doing all the modeling and other assessments, all those analyses that I mentioned earlier that they will be helping us do, which would be much of the technical input that goes into the plan. We then would have a draft plan ready in around the September timeframe for the Secretary's review. We'll then make the draft plan available for public review and comment. We also did that during the PCAP. And then December 1 is the due date that EPA has for us to submit the final plan to them. For a minute, I'm going to get into just a little bit of the technical work that we're doing right now that is kind of the starting point for the plan development. First, let me talk about the emissions inventory. Again, I mentioned it's a comprehensive kind of catalog of all emissions that are going on in the state from the various sectors that emit GHG emissions. And I'll talk about what a GHG emission is in a minute. We have done a number of GHG inventories in the past. We have 2005, 2010, and a series of years between 16 and 20 that are on our website. Our latest update to the inventory is 2021, which we will be using for the baseline for the CCAP planning process. All of these inventories use the EPA tool, the state inventory tool. and it is highly reliant on national sources of data like EIA, and Energy Information Agency, and others. So it's kind of a top-down, if you will, inventory that is very dependent on fuel sales, because much of the GHG emissions come from CO2 that comes from combustion of fossil fuels. So data sourced from all these various national sources, EIA, EPA, USDA, and others. We have already done a little bit of selective substitution we develop our own mobile inventories every year that we use for criteria pollutant planning. We're using that inventory as well for this purpose, because we believe it's far more accurate and also easier to use in terms of projections and program and strategy assessments. We've also used some of our state-specific waste management information and natural gas systems information. So we have made some changes. I'm going to skip ahead for a second. I want to talk first about what is a GHG. This slide basically shows you the specific pollutants that go into, they're categorized as a greenhouse gas pollutant. Obviously, CO2 is the largest of all of them, but methane is also a significant source of greenhouse gas emissions. Fluorinated gases, they're listed there. I won't go through them all, and nitrous oxides. So those are the main components of the GHG inventory. One other thing I would say is all this information, all these data and emissions information are calculated in millions of metric tons of CO2 equivalent. What that means is it's all based on CO2. So methane is a much more potent GHG than CO2 is. So for every ton of methane, we're basically turning that into a 28 ton amount of CO2 equivalent. So you're assessing that, you're accounting for that that additional potency of these other pollutants in the inventory. So going very quickly again, even with that said, CO2 is by far the largest greenhouse gas emitter in pollutant in Virginia, about 80%, followed by methane. Methane is mainly coming from, again, we talked about it earlier, coal mines, landfills, wastewater treatment plants, and then followed by nitrous oxides and the fluorinated gases. The fluorinated gases are mainly come from specific types of industries, microchip manufacturing, and from electricity transmission. Let me slide back for a second. I'm sorry, I bounced around the slides a little bit. This is the same 2021 inventory, just sliced in a little differently. It's by sector. And you can see here, transportation is the largest sector with about 50 million metric tons in 2021, followed by the electric power sector, industry, wastewater, and so on. It gives you the breakdown of all the various sectors and their emissions contributions to the overall inventory. So what has been happening thus far? This is a graph showing you the trends in GHG emissions in Virginia from 2005 to 2021. During that time, we've had about a 20% decrease in overall GHG emissions. Most of that has been driven by the power sector and the industrial sector because of the wholesale fuel switching, basically from coal to cleaner gas and renewables. Most of the other sectors have stayed mainly constant during that time period. So again, talk a little bit about the business as usual projections. We have already made a projection using the EPA projection tool. It is kind of a default business as usual scenario. We do not plan on using that as our final business as usual scenario because we know that Virginia has specific things going on that would not be accounted for in EPA's projection tool, like electricity demand growth. We all know that that's something that is the projections are coming out to be much higher than what this default BAU would be accounting for. Transportation growth and other growth. So we're going to be eventually developing a more Virginia-specific BAU that accounts for these more specific trends that are happening in Virginia, or will be happening in Virginia. So here's our default BAU. Basically, going out to 2021 is the historical data, and then it's projected back up using the EPA projection tool, mainly because it's driven by population growth and other national emissions trends. So that will be sort of our starting point. We will then, part of the task that the stakeholder group and the other input groups that we have is to identify other sources of data, Virginia-specific data, that will give us a more accurate business-as-usual scenario. And that's sort of what I just described. It's going to be built, the Virginia-specific BAU will be built on the current default and will be driven and changed or altered to reflect more Virginia-specific conditions and projections going into the future. That will then set the foundation for the CCAP by defining potential GHG emissions trajectories even before and after any potential control or control strategy analyses. And I believe that is all I have. And I know that's kind of torturous, a lot to throw at you at a quick amount of time.
Are there any questions or comments from the board? Emily, go ahead.
Thank you. So I just wanted to go back to the beginning on the two grants that have already been allocated by EPA. What's the time frame for the obligation of those funds from the EPA, and is there any concern that they could be at risk of being clawed back at a future administration?
The one grant, the methane grant, we have in hand already. I don't know if I'm not sure it would be pulled back at that point. The multi-state grant, I think, is in the final stages of being awarded. So I think it's pretty safe assumption that we will retain those grants. Never say never, but as far as the timing of them, we have to have them implemented and producing emission reductions during that 5-year time frame.
Thank you.
Yep.
Was there somebody over here?
Jim, I had a quick one.
Yep.
I just want to offer my congratulations to DEQ for basically securing a disproportionate amount of that money. I think $200 million out of what was appropriated was pretty significant so congratulations to the staff.
Yeah, I share that. Please congratulate your staff on the excellent work that they did and the excellent outcome that they procured.
And if I could, I might do that right now. I could introduce some of the staff that actually worked on that. Over
That'd be great. We'd
Ava
love to.
Levain, Julia Wack, and Allison France. And they have all fairly new DEQ employees, but have been instrumental in putting this program into place.
Well, very well done. Thank you for your efforts, and we hope you continue to produce at the same level for us during a long, long career. Any additional questions or comments? Thank you, Mr. Richter.
Thank you.
It's time in our agenda to take comments from the public. Have we had anyone sign up for the forum?
No, sir, we currently have not had anyone sign up. However, I do know that individuals have come into the room since the meeting started. So if there's anyone that is here today that would like to speak for the public forum, if you'd come forward at this time.
As a general rule, we require people to sign up.
They can.
So, and I think they know that.
So then I think the answer is no, sir. We do not have any more.
All right.
Just to make sure.
I'll ask the members of the board, is there anything further we need to discuss? Our executive director, anything? Mike?
No, I'm good.
Eric, you good?
Yes, sir.
In that case, without objection, we're adjourned.
Senate of Virginia, Richmond, Virginia.